second base, so the Oakland A's take.
I'll tell you what, we're having an earth.
Second base, so the Oakland A's take.
I'll tell you what, we're having an earth.
What you just saw was one of the more interesting moments in sports. Not interesting like that was amazing. Interesting in a sense that it's like, what just happened? Like, you want to know more about it. So, with Friday being the 25th anniversary of the World Series earthquake, I want to talk about people I know who've experienced it and feature them, and I want to talk about how I was first introduced to it, because this is one of the events that I've known for quite a while now.
Frank Reich, he talked about the three
It's a home run.
I first found out about this from a teacher I had 5 years ago. We were learning about earthquakes, and he decided to show the class a video on the earthquake that hit the San Francisco Bay Area for the 20th anniversary, I guess. He experienced it at UC Santa Cruz. He's one of two teachers I had who experienced it. You remember the man I featured in my World War II? World War I, 100 years later. What about the 75th anniversary of World War II video? He was actually at the game when the quake hit. I know I'm not the only one who was wondering, but if you want to know what happened after this part,
Second base, so the Oakland A's take.
I'll tell you what, we're having an earth.
Second base, so the
here he is to tell you what happened.
I'll tell you what, we're having an earth.
So yeah, I was at the game, and it was about a half hour probably before the game was going to start. The game was supposed to start at 5:30. It was 5 o'clock, and I was there with my dad and a friend of my dad's, and we were seated. We had good seats. We were just beyond like the overhang, and we were sitting in the lower section. And my dad had actually gone to the concession stand to get something to eat, and so I was there with his friend, and I'm sitting in the seat, and I was a freshman in college at Berkeley. And all of a sudden, I look out in the outfield, and I see the foul pole, the big yellow foul pole, and it swayed 20 or 30 feet in either direction, and you just felt this, pretty incredible shake. And when I saw that foul pole move, you realized something was going. It was kind of quiet. The stadium wasn't nearly full. It was probably only about a third full at this point because it was so early before the game started. About a half hour before the game started, and so there was kind of a gasp, and then it was really weird. I remember that we were sitting there, and all of a sudden after it ended, the fans in the stadium kind of cheered, like like it was. I don't think people realized what the impact of it was outside of the stadium, and so there was kind of this cheer, like the earthquake, and then there was this moment of kind of calm. Now the players were a little uneasy. And the players, I remember coming out of the dugout and going onto the field. And now my dad's friend, was a friend of his who was a big guy, probably about 6'4", 250 pounds. He played college football, and he was from Miami, and he had never been a part of an earthquake. He panicked, and he threw me over his shoulder like I was a sack of potatoes, and started running towards the field. I said, "Hey, calm down, it's all right." And he was really freaked out. And I think that's the difference between a native Californian and other people, and that I had experienced earthquakes, so it was by far the biggest one I'd ever experienced. But seeing it in that context was frightening. Well, then I remember sitting down and I'm like, okay, we survived that. Stadium's still up. Let's play the game. And this was way before cell phones or anything. And I do remember that a person seated behind me had a little portable television, and he was looking at it, and then we started seeing the pictures of the Bay Bridge with the fallen panel of the Bay Bridge, the fallen part of the road, and we started to realize that this thing's a little bit bigger than a normal earthquake. And then my dad had come back, and he said when he was in line, a chunk of the stadium, a big rock had fallen. Part of the chunk of the concrete had fallen, probably 30 feet behind him, and so shook him up a little bit. And so we realized this game is not going to be played that night. We thought, I was still kind of hoping that the game would still happen, but clearly it wasn't going to happen. And so it was just kind of chaos. The players were on the field. There was some uncertainty. And I can't remember exactly when they decided to cancel the game, but once they decided to cancel the game, we realized, all right, so we kind of left the stadium and went in the parking lot, and the parking lot was an absolute, standstill because there was a lot of traffic in the area and a lot of uncertainty. And we normally would get back to Berkeley, we would have to go across the Bay Bridge, but obviously it was closed. And so we ended up having to go all the way down the Dumbarton Bridge, which is, the traffic was a standstill, and we meandered our way through, and I ended up getting back to my dorm room in Berkeley around 1 a.m., and everyone there was still awake and kind of a little freaked out, and especially people that were from not California. And I remember one girl was in tears. This is several hours after it had happened. She was still shaken up, and I remember there were a lot of people who were concerned because the phone lines were down, so they couldn't call their families and stuff. So there was some uncertainty there, and also you saw the part of the on-ramp to the Bay Bridge, which had collapsed, and we'd seen some of that as we drove back in through Berkeley. But then the odd thing, the next morning, today I think things would be shut down for a month, but just for safety purposes. But I remember the next day we actually had class. None of my classes were canceled, and I remember sitting in class the next day, and I was in a journalism class, and a professor held up a newspaper. It was the New York Times, and it said, huge lines, earthquake ravages San Francisco, and and fires are out of control, and all this chaos. And I remember him saying, hey, we're in class. It happened right here. So what does that say about, how things are represented in the media? And it was horrible, but, I can't remember the death toll, but I think the death toll from the earthquake was less than 100, and which is terrible, but I don't think it was the widespread catastrophe that people outside of the area thought, because the infrastructure was so strong. And while the two bridges did collapse, thankfully they were less crowded than would have normally been because of the game, because the game was between San Francisco and Oakland. So a lot of people were at home ready to watch the game on television. So I think that actually was a blessing in that fewer people were injured because fewer people were on the roads because they may have been home to watch the game. I think the World Series was delayed for about 10 days, I want to say. And I remember I went back for when they started the game up, and it was a really emotional scene. They brought in all the emergency workers to throw out the first pitch, and so it was a real emotional event. And unfortunately, I'm a big Giants fan, and they got crushed in the game and ended up getting swept in the World Series and lost. But obviously, to be a part of history like that was really obviously a memorable day. And thankfully, it wasn't more tragic than it could have been. I mean, certainly we think about the scope of that earthquake, and it certainly could have been much worse. So we're lucky that it didn't do more damage, and obviously the people that died in that tragically, you don't want to overstate that. But I think when most of us look back, we realize how bad it could have been. So it was an amazing night, one that, 25 years later, I remember it like it was yesterday. So it was truly an amazing event. So those are my memories of the earthquake of 1989.
For the Giants, one of the most
well, he summed it up a lot more descriptively than I would have if I had done all the research I put on it. But this earthquake was one of the more memorable moments on TV. In fact, it was ranked number 9 on the top 10 craziest events caught on live TV, and number 10 on the top 10 crazy moments in sports. It measures 6.9 on the Richter scale and was responsible for 63 deaths and 3,757 injuries. This was tragic, but remember, it could have been worse, like the earthquake and tsunami in Tohoku. Close to 25 years later, California had another severe earthquake, which was quite as deadly. Only a major sporting event wasn't involved this time.
I'll tell you
I wonder how it changed future sporting announcements.
So
Though.
the Oakland A's take.
I also wonder what it showed on TV instead for all those people not living in California. 1.4 million people had electrical outages in California. A new bridge was built in that area recently, but I wonder how Charles H. Purcell would have felt. Well, that's pretty much all there is to say. Anyone who goes to see any game in person, whether it's baseball, football, basketball, or American football, be safe and hopefully something like this
Second base, so the Oakland A's take.
I'll tell you what, we're having an earth.
won't happen again.
A friendly face, a color, a familiar language, and a third to proceed no longer by paths indirect, but straight to home.
Collapsed into about 3/4 of a story.
25 years later, and here you can see what that intersection of Beach and Divisadero looks like today. Quake-damaged buildings torn down and replaced with new construction on 3 out of the 4 corner streets. Now, 25 years later, shoppers are back strolling the mall now that the scars of that terrible day have faded from view. Maureen Kelly, KRON 4 News.